It's Friday, November the 22nd. From The Economist in London, this is the week ahead, a look at some of the stories that will be in the headlines next week. I'm Tom Standage, the digital editor.
And I'm Tom Wainwright, the homepage editor. In the week ahead, German coalition talks come to an end, the world's most violent country holds an election, Vladimir Putin visits the Vatican, and America celebrates an unusual holiday. Now, Tom, Germany seems to be carrying out the world's longest election. Why are they still talking about it?
Well, there have been countries that have done without governments for longer, but they haven't been as important as Germany. So we had the election in late September. Angela Merkel's centre-right grouping was easily the largest party, but it didn't win an overall majority of seats, so it's having to negotiate a coalition. And this has been going on for 2 months now, and there's this deadline of November the 27th when they want to have come up with a deal. There were 3 potential alliance partners for this coalition, because the Free Democrats, the previous partners of Mrs. Merkel, didn't make it into Parliament this time around, which was a bit of a surprise. So the potential coalition partners are the Greens, the SPD, which is the biggest of the opposition parties, and a party called the Left, which is descended from the Communists. So putting the Left to one side, because they would be unsuitable in Mrs. Merkel's eyes, that left the Greens, and negotiations with them fell through. And so there's been negotiation around the idea of a grand coalition between the 2 largest parties with the SPD. And the problem is that there's been a grand coalition like this before, and the SPD felt it didn't do terribly well out of it last time round. So this time around, it's been asking for various concessions that it would require in order to enter a coalition. And they're things like reducing the pension age, which was put up in the previous government, things like a minimum wage they'd also like. And these are left-wing policies that Mrs. Merkel's supporters really aren't keen on at all. And what they're worried about is that if she grants them these sorts of things in order to get a coalition, it will be as if the SPD, even though it was actually the second biggest party overall, has won the election, because it will have been allowed to dictate the agenda. So there's been a lot of hostility among Mrs. Merkel's supporters about this. So we can expect the negotiations to go right down to the wire, and the question will really be to what extent, assuming a deal is done, Mrs. Merkel has given in to the SPD. The thing is, though, she may be able to concede on things and then sort of take them back later, because it's only when measures are actually put into law that they become final, and there'll be a lot of wiggle room at that point. Another complicating factor is that the SPD has said that it's going to allow its members to have a referendum on whether any coalition deal should be binding or not, and that referendum won't take place until December. So this just means there's going to be more instability and uncertainty. We've had Germany run by a caretaker cabinet for the past 2 months, and the outcome of these negotiations, whatever they are, seem very unlikely to produce a stable and decisive government, which is not just what Germany needs right now, but what Europe as a whole could also do with. OK, Tom, let's turn to another election, this time in the world's most dangerous country. So where is this?
That's right, it's rather different from Germany. This is Honduras in Central America, where the murder rate is about 85 per 100,000. Now, just to put that in perspective, the rate in Britain is just less than 1 per 100,000. So we're talking about an extraordinary level of insecurity. But sadly for Honduras, that's not its only problem. As well as the insecurity, which comes mainly through the drug trade, it's suffering from a very weak economy at the moment, partly because it's reliant on exports to the US, whose own economy is obviously very weak. If you've ever bought a packet of prawns or a pair of socks in America, then you've probably bought a Honduran product. But exports are right down at the moment, and on top of that, they've also got very serious political problems. The politics of Honduras is absolutely toxic, following a coup in 2009. That was when the then President Manuel Zelaya was bundled out of the presidential palace in the middle of the night, supposedly still wearing his pajamas, and put on a military flight to Costa Rica. Now, Honduras has never quite got over that. Society is still split absolutely down the middle. And with this political polarisation and a climate of violence and a terrible recession, it's been having an awful time. So this election comes at a time when Honduras really needs change. The difficulty, though, is that it looks as though the election is going to reopen some of the old wounds. One of the main candidates is Xiomara Castro, who's the wife of Manuel Zelaya. So she's back and running on a sort of anti-coup platform. She's got a new party called the Libre Party, the Free Party. At the moment, she seems to be statistically tied in the polls with Juan Hernandez from the ruling National Party. It's going to go absolutely down to the wire. But either way, it looks as though the Congress is going to be even more split than it currently is. So what we have is a difficult election in a very, very troubled country, and it looks as though Honduras still has a very long way to go before it solves any of its problems. Now, next week, Vladimir Putin is going to the Vatican to meet the Pope. Will this be a meeting of minds?
Well, perhaps more so than you might think. The meeting has come about because the Pope wrote to Vladimir Putin in September proposing that they get together because they have a shared interest in a non-military resolution of the conflict in Syria. They're both concerned about the rights of Christians in Syria, and they're also both keen for there not to be military intervention by the West. So that's the sort of origin. The background is also that there's been long-standing distrust between the Catholic Church and the Russian Orthodox Church for a number of reasons. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the Russian Orthodox Church thought that the Catholics were sort of coming in and trying to steal their believers. And there's also been a dispute over property that Stalin confiscated from the Catholic Church when he was in power and handed over to the Russian Orthodox Church, and about who should own that. And Vladimir Putin is the first leader of Russia or of the Soviet Union to have professed any religious faith since the Russian Revolution. And he likes to sort of, as well as wrapping himself in the flag, portray himself as a defender of Christianity, i.e. against Islam. And there's always been a very close relationship between the Russian state and the Russian Orthodox Church. So these things all fit together quite logically for him. And he's been trying to get the Russian Orthodox Church to resolve its differences with the Catholic Church for quite a while. He met the two previous popes as well. The trouble is that if he invites them to Moscow, and in fact the Russian government did invite the two previous popes to Moscow as well, the Pope won't come unless there's also an invitation from the Russian Orthodox Church, which has so far not provided one. But there does seem to be a sign of a broader thaw between the Catholics and the Russian Orthodox Church. They've sort of exchanged ambassadors earlier this month. They had these parallel meetings at a somewhat lower level. So there are signs that this sort of rift might be coming to an end, and there's talk of a meeting between the head of the Russian Orthodox Church and the Pope in Jerusalem perhaps early next year. And this is all part of a broader sort of thawing of relations between the Orthodox Church more broadly and the Catholic Church. So when Pope Francis was inaugurated in March this year, the head of the Orthodox Church overall, the Archbishop of Constantinople, attended that ceremony, and that's the first time that a Western Pope has been inaugurated with the presence of the head of the Eastern Church since the two churches split in 1054. So there's an enormous amount of ancient history here, but there's also the very real concern about what's going on in Syria at the moment underpinning these talks. And finally, Tom, next week there's an unusual holiday. It's just Thanksgiving though, isn't it?
Well, yes and no. It's Thanksgivica, or Hanksgiving, as some people might say. Now, this is the highly unusual collision of Thanksgiving with Hanukkah, both of which begin next week on Thursday, on the 28th. Now, this hardly ever happens because the dates of the two holidays are determined by different calendars. Thanksgiving always takes place on the fourth Thursday of every November, according to the Gregorian calendar, i.e. the standard January to December calendar. Hanukkah, on the other hand, the timing of that festival is determined according to the Hebrew calendar, which works on a completely different basis. Now, it's very, very unusual that the two coincide. The reason it's happening this year is that we have the latest possible date for Thanksgiving and the earliest possible date for Hanukkah. That's why they just overlap. And this is leading to all kinds of interesting cultural fusions. People are busily preparing Hanukkah foods, but with a dash of turkey or cranberry sauce or Brussels sprouts and that kind of thing. A company in New York has actually created what it calls a Menurkey, which is a turkey-shaped menorah. But I would advise people before they rush out to invest in a Menurkey, which I'm sure they were all about to do, it's worth bearing in mind that this won't happen again for a very long time. In fact, various mathematically minded bloggers on the web have come up with a next date of the year 79,811. So if you do buy a Menurkey, make the most of it, because you'll probably only get to use it once.
Excellent. Well, that's enough talking turkey from us. Join us again next week for another discussion of events in the week ahead. In London, this is The Economist.